All right, let's make a start. Pete, you can reveal yourself and unmute yourself. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah, I can hear and see you now.
All right. So we'll kick off. It's 3 minutes past. We might have a few more join in. As always, this call is being recorded. Not 100% sure if I'll send it out as a newsletter this side of Christmas, but it will be posted. A link will be posted on the iFind Property website straight after. So I'll get us started. So my name is Nick Gentle, and I'm the owner and sort of main content guy at iFind Property, and I generally put out videos and articles and what have you. iFind Property has been in the property sort of buyer's agency property finding space since 2007. I think Marie started the business. I joined in 2014. With me is Peter Ambrose. Peter has been investing in property since 1999. And he'll tell you he's seen and done it all over the years. And he is a property investment coach, the current president of the Wellington Property Investors Association. I am the vice president of the Rotorua PIA. And my first piece of advice to new investors is always to go and join their local group. Peter was my original mentor a few years ago when I realized I wasn't getting anywhere fast enough. So I reached out to him, and he does one-on-one mentoring, and it's very good. And today we're going to talk about commercial property investment. So iFind Property has long been asked, do we do commercial? And the answer was at the time no, because we had our hands full. And when the government changed the tax rules on us, and fingers crossed that will be reversed at the next election, but when they changed on us, we very quickly got asked a whole lot more about different strategies that investors can deploy to invest in commercial. And it was something I've always wanted to do, but never sort of got around to it, because it's a natural progression for investors who do well at the stuff that we help them do with get on board with investing in residential and start to build up. It's the old monopoly adage: if you take the 4 houses and you get the motel. And the tax changes just sort of put a bit of urgency around that in the terms of more people who are really interested in it. So what we're going to do today is Pete's got a presentation that he is going to run through. For those of you who are not familiar with webinars, the way to ask questions is through the chat button, which should be at the bottom of your screen somewhere. You can direct your chat to host and panelists, which I recommend. You can also direct it to everyone, so the other attendees will see it if you wish. I will be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and if that question I think makes sense to just interrupt Pete and throw at him right there and then, I will. Otherwise, we'll come back to it sort of at the end if it's a more general question, and we'll have time to go through once we wrap up the presentation. So to kick off today, we're going to go through just there's sort of 2 phases. One is sort of the theory, which is what are the different types of commercial property. Leases are crucial. How do they work? Some of the pros and cons of commercial property, and this is sort of relative to residential, because that's a space that a lot of us will know. So relative to residential, this is easier or better being in quotes, and relative to residential, this is more difficult, higher risk, or what have you. Then we've got 2 case studies, which is actually a single client who engaged us, and we found 2 properties, but they're very different, and that'll be quite interesting to dig through. And Peter will talk about his due diligence process and what he did to make those deals work. And then we'll finish up with sort of how you can get started, perhaps looking at commercial property and working with us to go and kick on. So Pete, I'm going to hand it over. And just again, guys, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat. And over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Nick, for that introduction. And welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for giving up your lunch hour if you're still working. And if you're not, thanks for giving up the time. I don't know what the weather is where you are, but it's very average in Wellington at the moment. So where else better to be in front of a computer learning some stuff. So yeah, I won't repeat what Nick said, but there's the agenda. I've got quite a few slides, so I'll probably whip through a few and go through some, I guess, some of the highlights of the slides and then answer any questions you may have. Nick's given you my bio, if you like. So I guess those of you that joined our webinar a week or two ago, we were having a chat, and I mentioned a couple of, I guess, tactics in this market that sort of, in my opinion, makes sense. One is in the residential space. I spoke a little bit about relocatable homes, how that could potentially make sense for the right property, because yes, there is a tax deductibility being a new build, but also, you know, the cost of new builds at the moment is probably slightly unpredictable at best. So it makes sense to look at potentially a relocatable in a section that you own or acquire. And the other tactic I spoke about was around commercial property. And I think in this environment, it's worth taking a little look at commercial property and how it may fit into your portfolio if it does, if you do choose to go down that path. So Nick asked me to put a little pack together explaining a little bit about commercial and a couple of deals that I found a client recently, and just explain a little bit more about that. So let's get into it. At a very high level, there's various types of commercial property. Obviously, you know, there's retail shops, which is probably not in a huge growth phase at the moment. There's office buildings, again, mixed, whether it's in a huge growth or not. I think people are starting to go back to the office, but overall, there's probably more office space available for lease. Warehouses, which is definitely in a growth phase as far as storage is concerned. Industrial buildings, which is your, I guess, your manufacturing, and quite often there'll be a shop there as well. Apartment buildings being a whole complex of apartment buildings, and then there's the mixed use buildings where you might see apartments on top and shops at the bottom, or there could be an apartment on the top and a shop at the bottom. They're mixed use, so they're a little bit. You've got to be a little bit careful around that, particularly around the GST component, because within commercial, there's generally, if you're over 60,000, GST involved, and there isn't in residential. So around sale and purchase agreements for mixed use, and even accounting, you probably need to see, you know, professional accounting advice around how you deal with that. So they're the various types of commercial property. I'll go into them a little bit more as we go through the presentation, and I guess the next slide's about how leases may work on all of those. So leases can be anything. They can be month by month, as we have in residential, but as a general rule, they're done on the Auckland District Law Society, or ADLS, like a tenancy agreement. So they're generally done on those. So you can pick them up quite easily. But they're generally done over 1, 3, 5, or even 10. You can get longer for bigger buildings, but as a general rule, it's around 3 or 5 as an option, with then the options to renewal. So you quite often hear the word 3x3 ROR, and that's ROR meaning right of renewal. So that means the tenant's got a 3-year lease, and then they've got 3 more rights of renewal where they can choose to take up that renewal or not. So a maximum of 9 years they've got for that tenancy. Then everything's renegotiable after that, of course. So that's what the RRR means, and there's the initial terms. So obviously, as an investor, the longer the term, the better it is for you as an investor, for some certainty of rent, and also the value of the building is generally more, because it's more desirable to other investors, because it's perceived as more of a safer investment. So therefore, you know, the potential to get to find a property, maybe it's vacant, and you put a tenant in there, then straight away you would think that you would increase the value of that building because it's now more valuable to another investor. just to give you a high level of how that may look. The rental increases can be linked to the CPI, which is the capital price index, which is basically inflation. Now, preceding the last few years, inflation was pretty much zero. So there were other terms that people put into their leases, CPI plus 1 or 2% maybe to a maximum. But if you look at inflation over the last year, it's been 7.3%. So a lot of people who are on CPI reviews are probably going to get a 7-odd%. I mean, it's all negotiable, of course. It's just in your interest as an investor to have your property tenanted, and if you need to work with your tenant to make sure that happens. So slapping a 7% might not actually work, but I mean, as far as legalities are concerned in the contract, there could be a 7% increase. And then every so often, whatever is in the market, whatever in the lease document, generally at the market review times, which is an example 3x3, so 3 years, but not necessarily that, you then get a valuation, a rental valuation done. That's generally paid for by the tenant. Not in all cases, but as a high level, you'd get a market review and then a change of rent accordingly. And that's all linked, it's all documented in the lease agreement. Generally, again, there's a lot of generalization because how long's a piece of string? Anything's possible on a lease agreement. You try and get the tenant to pay all the outgoing. So that includes the rates, any water, body corporate fees, insurance, which is a big one, which I didn't put on there. And that gets paid for by the tenant. And that makes your certainty of return easier to calculate as well. Particularly, if there's a building with like 2 tenants in, then proportionally done on the floor space, it'll be who pays what percentage of those insurance and rates. Okay, so the tenant needs to make good any physical changes. When they give the building, and I'll talk about this later, but when they give the building back eventually, then generally it's what they refer to as make good, where the tenant needs to return it to the, again, it's all negotiable. It might be that you want to keep it that way. But generally the tenant makes good all the changes. And some type of tenancies require a special council approval. Just because you're in an industrial zone doesn't mean you've got full industrial access. Kitchens, if you've got a restaurant or whatever, they require a special consent because of the fire risk. So when you're looking at a limb on a commercial property, it's always placed to check that there's a resource consent for the type of activity that's currently going on in that building. So what are the pros of commercial property? I do realise I'm going through quite quickly, Nick, but I think it's all quite relevant, and I'm happy to answer questions as well. So it's when it's rented, it's a good steady rental return. A lot of hands off, if you like. There are certain requirements that you have to do. A lot of them get done by the tenant as far as fire and safety and things like that. But it's a good steady rental return, which is what the key is here. Long tenancy terms with rent reviews. So as I mentioned, you could have 20-year leases. If for instance, supermarkets, they've got long leases, 20 years or more. And because they have such a solid lease term, you tend to find the yield on those, or the cap rate, I'll talk a bit about that now actually, if those are not quite familiar with that, is generally lower because it's more certainty for the investor. So therefore, the price is a little higher than what you would otherwise get. And that is because, the cap rate, which is effectively means the net yield generally. What's the net yield you're going to get? So in commercial terms, we talk about yield and cap rates, but they're generally net yields, not gross. Gross is more in the residential space, but gross can still apply in commercial, particularly like shops, small shops, dairies, for instance. A lot of those are mainly gross rents, which means that's the amount that you'll get as the landlord, and then you have to pay the rates and insurance over that. So you can see why I've said that most rents, and you're always trying to get in the tenancy agreement, a net lease where the tenant pays the rates and insurance. tenant takes care of all the maintenance. You don't. It's their business. When I say excluding the building, again, that depending on the conditions of the lease. A lot of them, the tenant takes care of building maintenance as well. Not in all cases. Even sometimes car parking or painting, things like that, but not in all cases. Now, this is quite key. Rent is worked out on a per square metre basis. So depending on the types of commercial that you're looking to buy, depending on the location, like if you talk about retail, for instance, retail, the square meterage of the shop front would effectively be a higher rate than the back of the shop, because it's more desirable to have a wider shop front from the retail space. So rents are associated with with the location where they are. With warehousing, it's generally done on a per square metre base of the warehouse, and then there'll be a different rate for the office as part of that. Each warehouse tends to have a little office associated with as well. That'll be a lot higher rate than the warehouse or storage areas. And also you can still charge for car parks as well. I mean, 15, 20, something like that, $20 a week per car park space annualized out. So, and you can even value the land that is not built up as well. So it's all done on a per square metre basis. I think the challenge that we find in commercial is finding out what those rates are. There's not the same access to information as you get for residential, where you can go on the NBIE site and find out, well, what are the bonds? You don't get the same information. As a general rule, you need to either talk with other with commercial agents, not necessarily the agent that's trying to sell you the property, but others, or you could pay for a valuation, which is a lot more expensive than residential and takes a lot longer as well. But getting comparisons of what this per square metre rate is for the type of property you're looking at, it definitely is a challenge, and where you need help on that. The value is based around the yield and influenced by the WALE. What's a WALE? That's the weighted average lease expectancy. And I mentioned that before, as far as the longer the lease, the more valuable the property becomes, as far as from an investor's perspective. So, utopia is finding a tenant that's going to give you a 20-year lease with a CPI review and the market rent review every 3 or 5 years, net lease on a nice new building, and then you pretty much walk away for the next 20 years and you've got guaranteed that income. Because if the business fails, or, I mean, obviously there's that chance, but even if they want to get out of their lease, they're still liable to pay the term. But the tenant can sublease. Unlike residential, where most of them are not allowed to sublease, with commercial tenants, they are allowed to sublease, i.e. they might sell their business. So the business comes with the tenancy involved as well. So the lease duration is definitely a pro, having a longer lease. And assignment of lease, as I just mentioned, generally pays the outgoings. Now, the tenants tend to pay their rent first, unlike a lot of experience in residential, because their business, their income is sourced from where they work. So it's pretty important that they pay their rent. And it's quite a mindset shift change. And they can make and seek improvements. Obviously, there's the building consent process if anything's major, but that's where you become part of that. But it's obviously got to be fit for their business. And there's certainty of rent, and there's some pretty high penalties for non-payment of rent. And there's a ratchet clause, not ratchet in a good way, not a bad way. Ratchet, generally, these lease agreements have a ratchet clause, which means the rents can never go down. They can only ratchet or go up, like a wrench. They can only go up, they can't go down. But everything's negotiable, but of course, but they generally have a ratchet clause involved in them. And there's a big one: less government interference in commercial space than there is in residential. It's really done by market forces, true market forces. And less management overheads. You don't need the property manager to go look at it and change tenancies. There are certain requirements you need to do. Again, a little bit more detail, but probably not needed today. Right, what are the cons? Why wouldn't you want to be involved in commercial property? Well, generally the interest rates are higher. How much higher is debatable in this very fluctuating market that we're in at the moment. They can vary from 0.25% up to maybe 1.5 or even 2% higher. It just depends on, you know, your own personal circumstances and which bank you use. It might not be much difference to what you're getting in the residential space. And it's the same with the next bullet point. High deposits? Well, not necessarily, because, you know, in some cases you can borrow 65%. In some cases you can only borrow 50, but as a rule, call it 60. So it's about the same as residential. Now, the issue with commercial is they generally require P&I. Now, that's the same in residential, I accept that. But the problem with commercial, if there is a problem, is that the amortization or the term of the loan generally starts out at 15 years, not 30, like you might get, or 25 in residential. And you can get a couple of years interest only to start with, but of course then that amortization or that term will reduce from 15 to 13. So it makes your payments a lot harder. And there's similar ways to try and mitigate that risk as there is in residential, as far as renegotiating a longer term, as far as going to another income source or financier. So, you know, there's ways to work through it. But if you're looking at a straight comparison, it's a 15-year term versus a 30-year term, which makes, you know, your repayments higher on a monthly basis, which means that the cash in your hand you want to be higher to be cash flow neutral, at least to wash your own face with it. Earthquake ratings have a huge impact for landlord and tenant, and there's some insurance risk now, particularly around Wellington, but it's the same, obviously, earthquake ratings all around the country. Probably won't harp on this too much, actually, because every centre is different. But if you're under 33%, then it's earthquake prone, and you've probably got till 2030 to have it all above, not earthquake prone, but above 67% means there's only a little risk. And if you want to lease to a government agency, I think they require 80%. But there's been, since the Kaikoura earthquakes, I guess the standard hasn't changed, but the interpretation of the standard has changed. They've been using a red book, and most recently they've introduced a new book, a yellow book, which interprets the new building standards, the NBS. And you would have read recently that a whole lot of government buildings have been vacated in Wellington because all of a sudden they're now considered earthquake prone, whereas a couple of months ago they weren't. And that's just to do with the interpretation of the new standards. And that's really around high rises and around the floor being hollow concrete.
I'll add that it's not just Wellington. I've got a colleague who invests in Auckland, has a commercial property with a government tenant, and they called in their own engineers. And I think the owner's earthquake standard, the report he got said 131%. The tenants, which is government's engineers, came back and said 30%.
Yeah.
And now they're having very tense meetings.
Yeah, and that definitely is, that's not an isolated case either. But yeah, so there are issues there, particularly with high-rise buildings. But earthquake is an issue as far as getting standards done, as long as, you know, if you had an engineer report done after the Kaikoura earthquakes, about 2016, I think, 17. It's anything done before that, you know, I wouldn't really listen to it all. Right, you can have long periods of downtime between tenants, of course. Now, those particularly around, you know, with COVID, office spaces and retail, and you've got no income coming in. So there's a bit of a risk. I mean, obviously, you need to get the creative brain going as well about how you may repurpose that building, if you can. There's a lot of conversions going on both ways, actually. There's conversions going from commercial property to residential. There's conversions going from residential into commercial. So both of those, their interest deductibility available as well. And I think that's a bit of a driver. I personally wouldn't do anything just because of interest deductibility, but it's nice to have that as a backstop. I think investment needs to stack up on its own, and that's a bonus. With any luck this year or next year, this could change anyway. Higher letting, management and selling costs, absolutely. As soon as you mention the word commercial, it's like ching ching, and you know, costs are a lot higher to do all of the above. I won't go into detail, but they're higher. And your outgoings are higher because you mentioned the word commercial. So if you need to get work done, generally it's higher cost. And it's not as liquid as residential, meaning like if I had a shop in the middle of town, I want to sell it, it's not something I can sell next week. It's going to take a while. Okay, so I hope that gives you a helicopter view. It's almost 30 minutes, unfortunately, but of the differences, the key differences between residential and commercial, and what may appeal. But there's some different tactics and strategies to use. Like, you know, if you've actually know someone, a client looking for a commercial space, then maybe you could find them a vacant building or them a vacant building and sign them up on a lease, and straight away you've got instant equity, right? If you can pick up the property a bit cheaper because it's vacant. So there's different tactics and strategies to use. If you've managed to put JVs together and you've got some cash, then potentially you could buy properties that are earthquake prone, but you know that there's a fixed cost to get earthquake strengthened. As opposed to I don't know how much it's going to cost, because they always cost a lot more than what you think. So there's lots of things to look at and lots of landmines to be aware of. So I had a client a few months ago come to us, and he'd sold some money, sold a business, and he's done very well, and he had up to 5 million to invest, and didn't really know much about commercial property, but he knew he wanted commercial property. He's already got some residential. So he obviously saw value in hiring someone. We're using iFind Property and myself as the commercial agent. So we embarked on the journey. So we sat down and we worked through, well, what are your requirements? What do you actually need? So once we'd worked through that, I came up with a set of rules for him. It also builds the confidence and the rapport about, well, I'm working for you. I'm finding a building for you. You're the one paying, so it's your interests that are important, not the selling agent. So we went through some initial education. We put some offers in. We missed out on a number of them by $500,000, but didn't want to pay too much, of course. But we decided on the following rules, and I think these are important to me as well. I'd like to control the land, so I want to. There's a lot of buildings out there that are units and unit titles, and I'm not personally a fan of those. They can work for owner-occupier, absolutely, and some investors. But for me and my client, they wanted a standalone building so you can control the land. Because you can build potentially in some areas up to 100%. They wanted a bottom drawer investment. It's very time poor. It must be industrial or warehousing. Wasn't interested in retail or commercial, retail or shop, office. Happy with one or more buildings, didn't matter. Open to anywhere in the country. And we agreed on free structure, including whatever travel I needed to do to go and inspect it. So that's the high level review. So a long story short, what we did as part of it, in each of these due diligence, obviously review what's important. The building's obviously very important, as is the tenancy agreement. The tenancy agreement is so important, as is the tenant, not just the tenancy agreement, the tenant as well. And, there are opportunities, particularly under an NDA, depending on the size of the business, to review their financials as well. There are opportunities, not in all cases, but it can be done. So we need to confirm the NBS, the new building standards, where it rated and when it was done and what type of assessment was it. Was it just a desktop assessment, or was it an engineer going on site and doing a full review? That has a bearing on risk. Needs to review the LIM and summarize it for them, what the good and what the bad points were, and spend a lot of time on the lease and the tenant, what the rent was, when the rent reviews were, was it a net or a triple net lease. Triple net means the tenant pays the property management as well. They're not quite so common, but they do exist. And what other landlord responsibilities, because every property you look at, it's different. So then I made recommendations for the buyer to follow up on, and obviously there's accounting, there's a apportionment, what's chattels, etc., depreciation. It's a new rule that came in, and around the building rental valuations, running some comparisons and just seeing where the rents stood in comparison to others, and did a drive around the area, what other similar buildings were for lease, what had just been sold recently, what was their per square metre rate, what was their tenant like, and compare the buildings. So just put that together. Every deal is different, can't stress that enough. So a couple that we picked up actually on the same day, funnily enough, but I'll whip through those, Nick. So there was a property in Hastings, nice new building, lovely building, purpose built actually for this client, J.A. Russell Electrical. So they've got a franchise around the country. But the tenant wanted bigger, even bigger. This is a great place in Hastings on the corner. A property had just been sold, similar to this, to another electrical company, and sold for a lower cap rate than what this one was. So we knew that was quite a good deal. So rating valuation was $2,060,000. I never really look at the rating valuations, to be honest. But it does show the rates, what the rates are. There's about $14,000 worth of rates there. It's paid for by the tenant. They're on a 8-year lease, 3/4. So the next review came up in next year, I think 24, but the final expiry was in 2036 if they went through that far. It had a rental appraisal of 140, I think it was 140,000, but they agreed on 136. Tenant that was looking for a bigger place, so they can't find one. There is a risk here. The risk on this one is that the tenant would go. So what we did is we looked around about, well, what are potential other tenants could do with this? What else could we cut the building in two? What could we do? And we've found at least 2 really good tenants that are looking for a place like this. So the risk is reduced a little bit. So there was the highlights there. Blue chip, 100% MBS, built in 2019, if my memory's right. So nice new building. And as a good national tenant, there's a net lease, good rental demand with low vacancy, had a nice ratchet clause in there. Recommended a price for them. A slightly lower yield because they're still better than the main centre. It was a slightly lower yield because of the quality and the risk, but a low risk in our opinion. We'll come to the summary later on. So the second one we picked up was this one here in Palmerston North. Really good tenant. This is the opposite of the other one, where the other tenant was good, but this was a really good tenant. It just spent a significant amount of money doing the upgrading inside. And they were on a long lease and wanted to stay. They just spent almost close to $1 million. The seismic rating was only 45% NBS. So a couple of issues there. We'd had a quote for $220,000 to do the earthquake strengthening. The tenant had signed a variation of lease to accept 45%, so they were there for the long term. And the advantage, I guess, of having a low MBS is that banks aren't going to lend on that. But if my client had cash, then they are able to purchase this at a higher yield, even allowing for the $225,000, which is what happened. So this particular one was $140,000 plus outgoings. Now the other one, sorry, I forgot to mention in Hastings, we missed out on the tender. We weren't high enough. Basically, what I did is I kept in touch with the agent. I just had a feeling that this wasn't going to go at that price, And a couple of months went down the track, and I rang him back. And anyway, long story short, by constantly following him up, we got it at an acceptable price to the vendor and acceptable price to my purchaser. And it was sort of like, wasn't on off market, but it was a negotiation. And we picked up, as it turned out, both on the same day. This one here we got on the tender day. We did a couple of tactics, which I won't go into. I'm going to say on a purchase agreement, but we got it at first day. So this is the complete opposite. The building wasn't as good as the other building, but the tenant was more surety in their tenure versus the other building. So it was a nice balance of risk. summarise what I said. We picked up at 2 million at 7% net. That's 7% net. That's after all the outgoings. So in effect, in the end of the day, my client paid 4.5 million, excluding a fee. Is getting 276,000 in the hand, which was a net return of 6.13, with built-in rent increases. So only going up. So that's, I guess, a quick summary of commercial pros and cons, and a couple of deals and the variance that you can get in high level as well. So I think, Nick, I'll probably hand over to you to have a chat, maybe talk about how to get started if you want, and any questions.
Thanks, Pete. For a while there, I thought we'd run out of time, but keep going. Have a glass of water. So now's the time. Any questions all about commercial property, from how it works to more about the deals to more about what Peter did with the client? Feel free to pop them in chat, and I will read through them. Just in terms of how to get started, really, what Peter described as the client's experience is going to be the experience that we work with you. Is essentially you come and have a chat with myself to start with, or Peter directly if you've done a bit of thinking and commercial is really the right thing for you. And we'll talk about, Peter is a coach and I do some coaching as well, as we'll talk about how it fits within what you have done to date and how it can help. And if it is the right thing for you, it might not be. Maybe it's too soon, or the potential downsides, long vacancy periods, etc., would leave you too exposed. Then you need to understand what that means and perhaps change your brief to buying a property with a more stable tenant and a lower return to remove some of that risk. Anyway, what I'm saying is we go through this stuff and it's an iterative process. There is no one size fit all with our buyer's agency on residential, and it's certainly the same here. Out of that process, we establish that your brief, what requirements you have, and you will also confirm, with your broker, the lending component, and probably have a conversation with your lawyer and accountant as well, just to bring them to speed with what you're looking to do. Your accountant might want you to place the entity.
Oops, looks like Nick is.
And we go through and put together a buyer's agency agreement. There is a travel budget because Peter is based in Wellington. He is our subject matter expert in commercial. So for the previous client, he was traveling to Hawke's Bay and Auckland. For our current client, he's traveled to Christchurch. And so we just have a little bit of a travel budget, not much, which we invoice at the start, and then we kick on and sort of work through the process. I see a number of people in here have bought through us in the residential side of things. Once we get into a deal, the process is really similar. It's a case of, hey, I've seen this, I like it, it might work. Shall we dig into it? And once you have indicated that you're interested, then we start to go and get the material and the information, what we can get from the agent. Commercial property is always going to be bought and sold by investors. So in theory, there should be a full set of information which investors can use to make their decision. That is not always the case. And one of the big things that Peter helps new investors with is figuring out what's missing, what's not, doesn't feel quite right, what's good, we need more investigation. And again, as he ran through all the different things you need to consider, that's going to just be a property by property basis, and helps you facilitate your due diligence. Obviously, the final buying decision is always yours, but that's the process. As you get to work with someone who's been here, done this for a very long time, and will keep you safe and on the right track to match your other investment experience and portfolio and wider property goals, etc. as well. So if you are interested following this call, please shoot either myself an email, nick@iPhoneproperty.co.nz, or peter@iPhoneproperty.co.nz. And we will just set up a call to start to work through all this with you.
Yeah. Just on
Yep.
what I didn't mention though is, I guess, well, what are the current yields? What are you getting? Because that's probably what everyone wants to know.
What are the current yields, Pete?
What are the current yields? Well, again, how long is a piece of string? They vary. It's a very interesting market at the moment. There's this huge gap. I mean, if you look at BNZ, for instance, I think some of their commercial rates are around 9%. And that makes it very hard to get a 10% yield, if you like, or cap rate, and make that 1% profit on, or even 9% break even if you're borrowing 100%. Not all banks are that high. However, you know, those people, there's a lot of people still with cash. You know, you'll be surprised to know that a lot of properties in Auckland are still going in the 5% yields. It's quite phenomenal. I mean, I think there's pressure. They've gone up, and there's pressure for them to go up in the sixes now. As far as what the cap rate is at the moment. That's after rates and insurance, of course, which is, I don't know, what's that, 7.5%, 8% gross, maybe something like that. Although there is interest deductibility, of course, so it makes it more attractive in that respect. But we are, you know, I've been finding some 7, well, actually in one place there was a 10% yield, but that's a much smaller city, more risk because it's a small city. So we weigh all that up. But right now, you know, I think the first half of next year could be some good buying opportunities if you're ready to go, and hence the reason for this call, because I think there's going to be some good buying opportunities, particularly the first half of next year. And it takes a bit of time to do due diligence, to present a few to you, if you like, to get a feel what you like, what you don't like, and work on the yield. So it's not something we just do overnight. It'd be great if it happened that way, but it doesn't. It's quite a process, and whereabouts in the country you may choose to or may not want to. I mean, commercial makes it a little bit easier to go anywhere in the country. I mean, you certainly can with residential as well, but commercial, you know, is easier, in my opinion. But the yields vary. At the moment, I've got a couple of clients. Their briefs around. The brief is around 6.5% minimum net yield, but they have a limited budget, and someone else has got 7. So it's got to be the right type of building with the right tenancy in place. That's the key. You can get that easily, but whether you want to or not, because of the risk factor, is another question. So, you know, you pay for risk basically, and that's why the building costs are higher when you've got a better tenancy agreement and a better tenant. It's exactly that reason, because there's less risk. So it's about working smart really on it.
I'm not sure if you mentioned that with the funding costs, if you have good equity in your residential portfolio, like a freehold property that you might be borrowing against, then a good broker will place a large amount of the borrowing, as much as they can, for the commercial property as with the residential security. So you get residential lending rates. So you go from 15 years P&I at the higher rate to normal residential rates, 25 or 30 years P&I. Yeah,
and it is tax deductible as well, even though you borrow it from residential. It's for the purpose of what you're lending for, and you're lending it for commercial, so that at the moment you'd still be able to claim the interest on that residential lending.
I do feel that with the triple CFA in particular, took a lot of investors out of the buying market who have bigger portfolios, who might typically then go and branch into commercial property as they move up. They've all been sort of come to a halt and are having to reassess, and I'll put my hand up. That's me. So it's going to be interesting heading into next year. I would imagine we're going to be heading into a fewer buyer, similar number of seller sort of market. And with the tone coming out from the Reserve Bank of, you know, we need to engineer a recession, etc., that will cause other people to pull back. So, and when the news is generally relatively grim, it's a good time to be a cashed up buyer. Even if you're not running around putting offers in like crazy, it's good to be lined up with the bullets and the gun ready to go in case something really interesting comes across your desk. So I think even in the residential space, particularly in this space, if this is something that you are considering, my advice would be get on top of it with your broker now, have a chat with your accountant now, and line up the pieces so that if you start to see, and we start to see some really interesting stuff come through, that you can move quickly. Because as Pete says, it takes a while to get things moving. And that's, we're not even factoring in the onboarding conversations with us to sort of work out what you want to do and what have you.
No.
So I'd encourage folks to use the summer, perhaps between now and sort of early February, to just have a conversation with your broker, have a conversation with your accountant, talk about what you're looking at doing. And if you don't wind up moving forward, then that's fine. But you know, you don't hit home runs on the balls you don't swing at. So it's good to be ready.
Yeah,
I made my money in resi by doing stuff before it was cool in particular markets. And I think commercial is a similar sort of idea.
Yeah, I endorse what you're saying. I think also, you know, just like residential, I get off-market deals as well. Generally, they're not that great because that's why they're off-market. But generally, but also there can be some good ones too. And if I don't know what you're after, I'll never know whether it's for you. But I've seen a few lately, a lot of sale and leasebacks, where someone's bought a business and they've bought a commercial property and they've run their business on there. And now one of two things is happening, or one of a few things. One is they're looking to exit, retire. So they split between, they want to sell the property, but keep a lease. As they're looking to exit. And another is, you know, maybe the business is not doing well and they need to sell the building to help fund the business. So, you know, just with the sale and leaseback, it just needs a little bit more due diligence on it. And also, you know, the latest one last week, actually, for a client, had a situation, but the rent was, should we say, the agreed rent, even though it's had 3 years to go on the agreement, was higher than market rent. So yes, they're locked in for 3 years, but what's the risk? So yeah, understanding all that's quite important. As in the words of Kenny Rogers, every hand's a good winner and every hand's a loser. It just depends how you play. So.
I have one question. Been waiting for this one. How much does it cost to work with us? So I can answer that. The deposit to start looking for us with us is about $5,000, and that's half of that is a sort of a travel fund that we agree with you as we look at properties that we're, you know, have agreed to go in and have a proper dig into. The agency fee for success it hovers between 3.5% and 2.5%. Obviously, the higher the property gets, the cheaper it gets. The way we do it is when we agree with you at the start of your search, the brief and the goals that you're looking for, etc., is we're factoring in, you know, to that our fee for the service, and also the, you know, often when you take something over, less so with commercial if it's got an existing tenant in place, but there are some upfront costs that you'll need to spend, perhaps some deferred maintenance, and what have you. Outside of our costs, the probably other fee that you need to be aware of is the due diligence is a bit more expensive with commercial, and part of your lending might be to get a valuation done, and valuations can be tricky. In a softer market, you see fewer properties going for tenders, but again, the high demand properties will. So you sometimes have the issue where you need to spend some money getting a contract drawn up and doing a valuation for just to make a bid. However, I would believe that I think, and Pete, correct me if I'm wrong, that we should be able to put an offer in subject to due diligence period and cover most of that off if we do, but that due diligence does come at a bit of a high cost.
Yeah, it can do. Just on the travel, that's a budget, and what's not spent is deducted off your fee when you go unconditional. I don't think I've spent any more than about $800 on any one client. I don't travel lightly, as it were, as far as I only go when I need to, when we've agreed that this is something worth looking at.
Yeah.
I'd rather be at home in Wellington. You know, so it's used sparingly, and whatever's not used comes off the fee. So I wouldn't worry about as being a travel. I'm not going to Fiji with it. Although I'm off to Hawaii shortly, but that's another kettle of fish.
You won't get for $800 in Hawaii.
Yeah, and due diligence most certainly can be part of your, obviously it's the same as residential. If you're cash, you're in a much stronger position, of course, but realistically you want some sort of due diligence. And as Nick said, the biggest cost is going to be, and time and money, but it's about getting valuations done, comparables and market rates for square meterage, etc. But also with commercial, just like residential, you can be creative. I'll give you one example if I've got time. If you own the building, potentially you can do things with it. Even things like putting a billboard on there, whether you're for them or against them. If you're an investor, it's a way of making money, why not? So, you know, you can get good money depending on the location, just putting an electronic or even just a wooden billboard. And it gets added to the, you know, it's another stream of income. It adds value and therefore increases the value of your property. Little things like that, there's a whole lot of those little things. If you're able to do that in the lease, unless there's exclusivity from the tenant, but lots of little things. So there's always, you know, value add opportunities that I look at when we look at properties as well, not just what's there. Let's look at what other things we could do to extract more money out of that building or land.
Thanks, Pete. Are there any other questions, team? Otherwise, we might let folks get back to having their lunch. No? Okay, if you do have any other questions later, you can fire them through to me or Peter. We thank you for taking the time out today. The recording for this will be online probably tomorrow. So if you want to listen to it later, I'll put it up as a video and also as a audio file so you can have a listen while you drive. Thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate it. Have yourselves a very good Christmas break. Hopefully it stops raining. And we'll see you all in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks
all, Peter.
Cheers.